Hello again to you, everyone. Isaac Petcash, Erie News Now, back on the Erie News Now Alert Desk, the brand new Alert Desk, as we are continuing our coverage in the sentencing of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who was convicted of murdering George Floyd just a couple of months ago in April. And where we left off, the judge had called a recess after hearing testimony from both sides to see whether or not, but how the sentencing would come down. The prosecution has asked for 30 years. The defense has asked for probation. We expect somewhere between that. There were reports of 20 to 25 years from the judge, but there is no guarantee of what we will have just yet. I want to bring up the Minneapolis courtroom here that has been the place both for the trial and for the sentencing. We expect in about 45 seconds the hearing to resume. Now, there's no guarantee the judge will announce the sentencing right away, but he has taken time to review all of the procedures, all the testimony and things of that nature, just to see exactly what the sentencing should be. So in Minnesota, the minimum proposed sentence for second-degree murder is 12 and a half years, with the maximum sentence carrying 40 years. So that is really the ballpark range that we're looking for here. The defense arguing probation, not likely to happen, but again, not exactly sure what the deal will be until we find out the official wording here. So we're going to go inside the courtroom, see if we can hear anything as it's about 3:45, as we hear potentially the verdict and the sentencing in Officer Derek Chauvin's case. Again, I'll hop back in here right now. What we're just waiting for is the judge to sit back down, Judge Peter Cahill, to see if he will hand down the sentencing right now. You see some movement in the background beyond the glass, but still, as we see it, there is a bit of a delay. 3:45 was the expected time, but we are waiting just to see whether or not there will be a sentencing handed down immediately. Once again, if you were with us on our last Facebook Live, our last live stream, we heard from the prosecution and the defense. We also heard from several members of Floyd's family, including his 7-year-old daughter, who sent in a video message just kind of explaining how things have been for them since the end of the trial and since the killing just over 1 year ago. We also heard a little bit, not much, from former Officer Chauvin. He offered his condolences to the Floyd family and said, "I hope that you find some peace of mind in the coming weeks." So could be more information to this case that comes out later, but obviously the sentencing happening today. So again, we're just waiting on the Minneapolis courtroom to come back to order here. Also, too, want to mention tonight as we bring you back in here to the alert desk in the double box is that we will have full coverage of this sentencing tonight starting at 5 on Erie News Now. Earlier today, we talked with a local attorney in Erie and we asked how could cases like this, if anything, change the landscape of how civil cases are dealt with in Erie. And he actually had a couple of interesting answers saying depending on this sentencing, there could be some things that change in terms of what evidence is brought to the table and what factors are considered in civil cases, even here in Erie County. So although the case happening in Minneapolis, there are still some connections that can be drawn to the Erie area and to what we might see for cases moving forward. So we're going to have some coverage of that and kind of explain what the similarities are between cases we see in Erie and surrounding counties, as well as things that we see in places like Minneapolis and other cases across the United States. So there is a local tie to this as well, not necessarily in the case itself, but depending on what comes down in this sentencing. A couple of things we want to consider. There were two things the judge also has to take into consideration in addition to the testimony. The first thing is what's called mitigating factors, which is what the defense is providing. Mitigating factors, of course, factors inside of the case, inside of the evidence, that would allow the defense to make a case that the punishment should be less than what the prosecution is putting out there. Aggravating factors are just the opposite, instances within the case that would allow for a longer sentence than what's recommended. So whether there's children on the scene, whether it's a high crime area, whether or not there was some sort of a ulterior motive behind the police officer and his action, all those things are considered in this sentencing by Judge Peter Cahill, depending on what he decides here. So again, 12.5 to 40 years is the range of what could potentially be coming down here. The prosecution has asked for 30 years. You heard members of the Floyd family request the full sentence, and they also don't want any partitions within the sentence. They want it to go in succession, which means no chance of parole, no chance of getting out early for good behavior. The defense has requested parole, which is not likely. That means no jail time, in essence being looked at by police officers and other members of law enforcement for a period of time, but it's not likely that that will be the case. So everything taken into consideration here is we are just currently awaiting the judge to come back into the courtroom. Again, right now for the judge, this is all deliberating, hearing some of the evidence that he was able to acquire, not just from the case, but information today. He now has to make a decision as to how long this sentence will be. And it can be, and again, it can be between 20, 25, 30 years. It could be longer than that. But again,
thank you.
We are going to see what
We're
happens.
back in
Right
session
now,
and on the
sentencing
record.
coming down, we anticipate. Let's see.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank everybody for being here and for providing the input you did. Not just the people who were in the courtroom here, but also those who provided written statements, both from the Floyd family and the defendant's family. I've read all the impact statements that were submitted earlier and listened carefully to all the input here today. And it is truly appreciated that you took the time to stay with this case and to provide me with input. I have reviewed the pre-sentence investigation and carefully considered all the facts of the case and the law, but my comments are actually going to be very brief, because most of it's going to be in writing. I have a 22-page memorandum that is going to be attached to the sentencing order. And why am I doing it in writing? To emphasize the fact that determining the appropriate sentence in any case, and in this case, is a legal analysis. It's applying the rule of law to the facts of an individual and specific case. And that is why, as opposed to trying to being profound here on the record, I prefer that you read the legal analysis that explains how I determined the sentence in this case. What the case is, or what the sentence is not based on, is emotion or sympathy. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge the deep and tremendous pain that all the families are feeling, especially the Floyd family. You have our sympathies. And I acknowledge and hear the pain that you are feeling. I acknowledge the pain not only of those in this courtroom, but the Floyd family who are outside this courtroom and other members of the community. It has been painful throughout Hennepin County, throughout the state of Minnesota, and even the country. But most importantly, we need to recognize the pain of the Floyd family. I'm not going to attempt to be profound or clever because it's not the appropriate time. I'm not basing my sentence also on public opinion. I'm not basing it on any attempt to send any messages. A trial court judge, the job of a trial court judge is to apply the law to specific facts and to deal with individual cases. And so, Mr. Chauvin, as to count 1, based on the verdict of the jury finding you guilty of unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony under Minnesota Statute 609.19 subdivision 2 paren 1, it is the judgment of the court that you now stand convicted of that offense. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute section 609.04, counts 2 and 3 will remain unadjudicated as they are lesser offenses of count 1. As sentence for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd. You are granted credit for 199 days already served. Pay the mandatory surcharge of $78 to be paid from prison wages. You're prohibited from possessing firearms, ammunition, or explosives for the remainder of your life. Provide a DNA sample as required by law. Register as a predatory offender as required by law. And then you will receive a copy of the order and also the attached memorandum explaining the court's analysis. Anything further from the state?
If this needs to be said, we just ask that it be executed forthwith.
Defendant is remanded to the custody of the sheriff to be transported back to the DOC or whichever custody is currently holding him. Anything from the defense?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you. We are adjourned.
There you see former Officer Derek Chauvin leaving the courtroom, and you see the breaking chyron at the bottom of our screen. It's just been handed down. 270 months is equivalent to 22 and a half years. That is the sentence that former Officer Derek Chauvin will serve in the killing of George Floyd, now the murder of George Floyd, when it comes to this case. So, as we see it right now, again, the minimum proposed sentence in forth by the state of Minnesota for a second-degree murder is 12 and a half years. So Judge Peter Cahill putting 10 years on top of that minimum sentence for around 22 and a half years of time. Now, again, there were a certain amount of days that Officer Chauvin had indeed served already, so he will get credit for those days. But as it stands right now, 22 and a half years is what former Officer Chauvin will serve in prison for the murder of George Floyd. Now, you might have heard also that 2 counts of this murder are not going to be considered, or at least stand unadjudicated, was the official language by the judge. Right now, the only thing that was being considered for sentencing was this first count of second-degree murder. It's possible the other 2 charges will adjudicate eventually, but at this point, the only thing that was being considered was the charge of second-degree murder. So 22 and a half years for that singular count for Officer Derek Chauvin, and he will serve that time in federal prison. So you think about exactly how this went down and what the prosecution was hoping for and what the defense was hoping for, you really meet somewhere in the middle. The prosecution was looking for 30 years. That's what the prosecuting attorney had said in the courtroom today, and you heard him say that just a few minutes ago. Members of the Floyd family were asking for the maximum sentence. 40 years is what they were hoping for. And the defense was looking for probation, which included 0 jail time, simply looking after the officer and making sure, almost putting him on a leash, for lack of a better term, and not allowing him to do any sort of specific things that you would do in normal everyday life. But this 22.5-year sentence is what a lot of local attorneys that we spoke to today expected. They said between 20 and 25 years is what they expected Chauvin to get. Right now, they're in the middle of that. That's exactly, you split it down the middle, and that's what we're at, 22.5 years. So it's 10 beyond the minimum, and so we continue to see exactly what this means for the judiciary system. Now, the big question, of course, tonight that we will be asking, and many people around the country and in Erie will be asking as well, was this sentence harsh enough? Was it too harsh? You think of the 12.5 years minimum proposed sentence for second-degree murder. You take that up 10 years. But again, many people potentially saying tonight that that wasn't a long enough sentence. We're not the judges. We're just proposing what many people are going to bring up, we believe, this evening. But at 22.5 years and 270 months, that is what the judge has brought down for the killing and the murder of George Floyd. So that's the sentencing. As of now, there really won't be too much more that's settled with the case. There may be a few details here and there that continue to trickle out. This is a case that at the moment concurrently is what we're hearing. So again, just a lot to consider as we look here at the sentencing coming down just about 4 o'clock. So this sentencing trial taking just about an hour and a half to complete. It began at 2:30, ending right around 3:55. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can pull up another camera here so we can show some of the reaction here in Minneapolis. I believe this is yes, so this is right around the area where the court just occurred, where the court just adjourned, if you will. And so clearly there is some protester and gathering at the moment, and some individuals also looking to see if they can have some sort of a comment. We do expect a press conference from the prosecution, some of the attorneys as well who are going to be part of this. We expect them to be speaking this evening as well, so we'll have to see exactly how that turns out in the next couple of minutes. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep it on this scene here. We're trying to load a couple of graphics for you so we can show this across to you in picture from our alert desk. So we're just going to take 1 minute here to step aside. We'll be back in just a second to see if we can play this for you graphically and show you how the sentencing compares to what the minimum and maximum was expected.
They're all here, see? They're not.
Wait, now?
3 o'clock.
Okay, it's almost 3.
I know. That's the lucky. I'm going to be here too. Sure. Okay.
So,
All right, folks, so we're back here on the alert desk. I apologize. I was just loading a couple of graphics into our new alert desk computer system here that allows us to do a lot of cool things. So we'll bring you back in the picture-in-picture, and then I'm going to bring you over here to our big board so we can show you exactly what this sentencing looks like in picture. So let's bring you over here to the big board just so I can show you exactly how this plays out. So if you see here, the sentencing for former Officer Chauvin, 22.5 years. This just accounts for the second-degree unintentional murder. That was the big charge, the number one charge that Chauvin was found guilty of a couple months ago in court. So when you look at these two other charges, the third-degree murder and the second-degree manslaughter, those charges are not part of the 22.5-year sentencing that Chauvin received earlier today. Those two stand unadjudicated, and they may come up in future trials, but as of now, at 22.5 years attributes to this. So there's one specific conviction that goes to this 22.5-year 22.5-year sentence for former Officer Chauvin. I want to take you to a timeline, and we were talking about this, comparing the maximum sentence to the minimum sentence and what we could expect to see. This is kind of how it plays out visually. So the minimum sentence here that was proposed, the minimum imposable sentence for second-degree murder, at least that is prescribed and proposed by judges in Minnesota is 12 and a half years. So that really was the benchmark of what we were looking at for this trial. Chauvin really wasn't going to get any less than 12 and a half years in prison. The maximum, though, was 40 years, and you saw the prosecution really pushing upwards of 30 to 40 years for Officer Chauvin. We were talking and during our Facebook Live, and we were saying about the fact that we expected the prosecution to push for 30 years, and they did. We expected the Floyd family, who was also testifying today, explaining their grievances, to also go for upwards of 35 to 40 years. So that's exactly what was the case today. And so you look in this area and you say this is what the prosecution wanted. This, though, is what the actual verdict was. So if you're playing the scales, it's slightly, I won't say it's in the defense's favor, but it's not as much as the prosecution would have liked. It's 7.5 years less than what the prosecution was hoping to get, but it's 22.5 years more than the defense was hoping for. Remember, the defense was hoping for probation and parole. The minimum sentence, 12.5 years, so it's 10 more than the minimum, but it's 7.5 less than what the prosecution was hoping for. So again, a fairly lengthy sentence. 22.5 years is a long time for anything, but that's how it plays out visually. So we'll get out of the picture here and kind of show you, almost like a weatherman here, 10 years longer than the shortest sentence possible, and 17.5 years less than the maximum, but 7.5 years less than what the defense, or rather the prosecution, was looking for in a 30-year sentence. So I'll take you back here to this camera. We'll wrap up our Facebook Live tonight. We have a lot to get to in this trial this evening on Erie News Now, starting at 5. I also promised that we would be talking to local attorneys and explain how this trial and this case might be able to connect some Erie cases, and if it changes the landscape of civil cases across the nation, including here in Erie, Pennsylvania. We're going to explain that to you in just a few minutes when we go on the air on Erie News Now at 5 o'clock. But again, in case you're just joining us, former Officer Derek Chauvin, Minneapolis police officer convicted of murder of George Floyd, has been sentenced to 22.5 years for the second-degree murder charge of Floyd. So he will be serving that time concurrently and starting from today. A lot more coverage throughout the day and throughout the evening as we continue here on Erie News Now, both from the Alert Desk on air and online. We hope to see you then. Until then, everybody, of course, stay safe, stay healthy, and enjoy your Friday. Erie News Now at 5 starts in just about 50 minutes.